there's this quote. It's like, people don't have ideas; ideas have people. And so, you have a philosophy even if you neglect the study of it.
But a lot of people would say, listening to this, okay, philosophy, apologetics, they kind of go hand in hand. But you brought up skepticism, and they would say, doesn't just studying philosophy, the Greeks, like you mentioned, you're always telling me you're reading Plato, you're reading a lot of Plato right now, and I would encourage that. But they would say, isn't that going to lead to skepticism? Isn't that what's causing the problem? Why not just avoid that stuff altogether?
I mean, it's still there. I think it's like you can if you put stuff under the rug, it's still there underneath the rug, even if it's not visible. So
The doubts and the questions.
and I think that'll give you more of a superficiality.
Yeah.
And so encountering those problems, and I think skepticism is it's like the first step into growth in those ideas, where I'm glad even though that skepticism is uncertain, I'm glad that I had that, so that now I can be in confidence of these ideas that I live by.
Yeah.
Because I mean that gives it so much more depth. That I mean, if you're living as a Christian, it's should be the most important part in your life. And so it's not something to joke about. I would say I want to be pretty confident that these things are true, because these ideas, like something like loving your enemies, those are hard. And so I want to be confident that is what I should be doing.
Yeah.
That it is true before I do the difficult task.
Yeah. Truth is what you're highlighting here is you're not a Christian just because it feels good.
For sure.
Or is easy or anything. Or even because it's hard and it's difficult and I like a challenge, but because it is true. And truth is a philosophical idea.
Exactly. I think it's I was listening the other day about this idea about like cultural Christianity, which is more the emphasis on the like on the emotional part, which is important, but I think the truth claims are just as important if you're gonna take these as a way of life. You mentioned truth. I think it's important for Christians, because at least you're going to encounter a lot of I've talked to some of my friends that are in college, and they say it's like, well, you have to be confident if you're a Christian, because I mean, if you don't question yourself, and in Kings, because of there's more of a common belief here. Of course, not everybody's a Christian here, but I think there's college gives more of an opportunity to have friends that will poke against you, and so that'll, I think,
naturally cause these questions that make you wonder if it is true.
Yeah, and I think that's important, because if you haven't questioned it at all, and then something like when you have a hard day and somebody tells you, well, forget about that. What's your foundation there? And so it's important as Christians, and especially I think navigating through the realm of ideas.
Can I read this to you?
Go ahead.
Because there's this passage in Colossians that I think really turns some believers away from philosophy when they first hear it. And you'll know what I'm talking about when I read it here. Colossians 2:8. This is Paul. He says, be careful that no one takes you captive through philosophy. And everyone just goes, oh, see, this is...
Yeah.
But then he says, and empty deceit, and then he qualifies it based on human tradition. So Paul isn't saying all philosophy is bad. He's just saying certain kind of philosophy is bad. That is a philosophy that doesn't come from the fear of the Lord, to quote Proverbs 9:10.
I like that verse.
Yeah, and you would advocate for that. Yeah, and I think Paul would too.
Yeah.
If you read Paul, you probably would consider him, in his Mediterranean world, a Jewish philosopher. So I like what you're saying.
Well, I think especially, and when Paul goes to Greece, I think he encounters those ideas that still the culture is based upon Homer and Plato, and there's still, I think, he might be referring
Yeah.
to there is at least
He quotes their poets
yeah.
and their writers, and he's debating the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in Athens
yeah.
at the Areopagus. That's like Harvard, Yale, and Duke rolled into one. So yeah, that's an interesting point. He's there in the center of society, and he thinks the gospel belongs there. Like, that doesn't just tell you something about Paul's boldness or the success of missions, that he took the gospel to the very center and the highest point of culture, says that's where it belongs, not in this kind of, in other words, this very public sphere of ideas where things are debated and reasoned out, not just in here.
Yeah. So there's this this church father quote, I don't know how early, and he says when Jesus went to hell after he was crucified, that Socrates was the first one there waiting for him. And so, which is funny because the Greeks weren't, at least Plato and Socrates, they weren't Christians in the sense that we think of Christianity. But I think that a lot of the virtue ethics that they talk about, that should you do good, should you be good, why, what is good, and so that they would coincide a lot with Jesus's teachings. And so a lot of Socrates, what he combats are what called the Greek sophists, which were kind of like they were sly. They were good with words, but they would kind of use vague arguments to defend whatever they wanted to do, with whether it be just following your desires or doing whatever you want. And so they were good at that, and Socrates combats that with a lot of I think he calls it like a knack, and that as what he defines as a true philosophy is buttressed by knowledge. And that a lot of these opaque arguments that the sophists make are just they're just flattering you and convincing you with their words, but it's kind of empty when you take a further look at it. And I think in dialogues like the Gorgias or the Republic, he kind of combats those, and I think that he triumphs, but which is like Plato and the Greeks, they didn't encounter Jesus and his teachings, but a lot of them were intertwined, and that
asking a lot of the right questions.
For sure. Yeah.
And without question, in many ways, on a very genuine journey for truth and knowledge, which I think we could see, at least being Christians ourselves, Christianity being ultimately the answer to a lot of that. Yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, truth is a philosophical, I'm losing the word, concept.
Yeah.
And so like these are,
it's called more or less epistemology, which is a big fancy word for just a discipline in philosophy. So it is.
Yeah.
And it's got a major emphasis in our Bibles, truth, knowledge, these words are used. But the difficult thing is the text doesn't explain what those terms mean.
Yeah.
It just sort of uses them, and it's indeterminate about, well, what is knowledge? How do I know when I have knowledge? What are the conditions that need to be there for me to say, I know this?
And that's where I think that philosophy can work
philosophy.
as a tool.
What do we mean when we say truth? Like, what does that word mean? I don't think we mean it to say that I just believe it.
Yeah.
Because we believe in things that we also think are false. Right? So
Yeah.
what makes a
And
proposition
you mean,
like Jesus rose from the dead true? So those are
philosophical
good. We wouldn't say those are
conversations.
anti-Christians,
Yeah.
anti-Christian questions. It's just there are plenty of things that are emphasized in our Bible that just aren't fully fleshed out.
Yeah.
And philosophy could come in and help bring some clarification, kind of like the medieval Christians thought. Theology was always the queen of the sciences, but philosophy was her handmaiden.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where the text was indeterminate.
Mm-hmm. What you said about somebody
Yeah.
who even if they don't encounter these scary ideas, because they have effects on your beliefs that Christians, if you're a Christian, you will build your life upon. And so, I mean, even if you're not, I think there's this quote, it's like, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And so you have a philosophy even if you neglect the study of it, but
Yeah.
you're just written,
Yeah.
you're living somebody else's words, and you're
Yes.
not aware of what's going on here. I think that's,
you have a starting point.
Yeah.
Your culture has given it to you.
and that's based on a lot of the ideas that you talk about is who's discipling you. And I mean, I don't blame people for being based in their default, which is just what ideas that are based in our culture, but these ideas are based on, I mean, it's maybe you agree with the ideas, but then you find out some of the other, like, it's like some of the other options, and you're like, wait, that sounds more reasonable, at least in like in ethics, and which are things that, at least for, if you're voting, they have importance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a scary thought. We don't come to Christianity empty.
Yeah.
And we have already all of these, if I can put it this way, unthought thoughts about what is good, what makes something good, or what is truth, and what makes it true, and how is it true. And like, we bring all of this baggage, this sort of philosophical baggage to it. And I think you're dead on. What ends up happening is Christians will be sort of spiritually born again in their spirit, but not in their mind.
I'd agree.
You know, and so they're regenerated. And so there's a sense in which, yes, they've been sort of transformed, but their mind is no different than it was. So they still don't think like a Christian. They might sort of assert certain Christian things.
Yeah.
But if you press them as to what it means, all that baggage that they brought with them that hasn't been regenerated or just carefully thought through and sifted through with this and just good critical thinking,
So
it starts to come out, you know?
there's this quote I heard Sam Harris on a podcast, and he said, he's like, the issue is that it's so easy to, with words, say something like that there exists like a square circle. Logically, it's completely impossible, but I can say it, and like it's just as saying another word, that a square circle exists, that proposition. But even though it's totally illogical, I can say it, and there's like no, it's
You're not
isn't
really
always
cognizant of what you're
Yeah.
saying. It's no different than a burp.
yeah.
It's just something that just kind of came out of you, but there's no thought behind it.
And so, I mean, I think that's why, at least, I mean, your position will be different than mine, but mine, like, and going into college next year, it's something I'm going to be encountering with, like, people that think differently, and I think that's important to have those discussions. But being able to, if you're familiar with the arguments and the ideas that I think warrant Christianity, you can, it's like, oh, I've seen this objection before. It's not as scary as when the first time you hear it and you're like, wait, I don't know, morals are relative.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I've seen this before, and I don't think it's as logically supported on a atheistic worldview than on a Christian worldview, and here's why. And so there's a lot more growth, and that's I think where it comes in for evangelizing, especially if you find other people that are thinking, and the common, maybe canned Christian arguments won't suffice.
Yeah. Well, that's good. For you, I mean, it's obvious philosophy is a clear handmaiden to theology for you. And,
Yes.
And as it has been for Christians for a long time, it's only recently that we've given that up. But it seems like it's been a crucial part of discipleship for you.
I agree. Yeah.
And in answering these questions that could have become doubts and could have led to perhaps you walking away from the faith have only by leaning into them and pressing on them and thinking really hard about these sort of fundamental questions logically, it's strengthened you in a way to where when you now encounter this stuff, you have a little bit of fortitude.
I think it's what has led me to faith and to more of a conviction is that I got to do this. I can't just keep
These
on.
are things in your life that the Spirit used to. Yeah, that's
and it gives more depth too. Being able to, I think, more of a philosophical understanding,
more of a knowledge
things.
of God.
It gives it a lot more depth,
which I don't think is antithetical to a love of God. The more I know my wife, I don't love her less. I love her more.
Yeah.
There's more to love. There's more to appreciate. That greater knowledge leads to that greater love. I also can't really love God for who he is if I don't know him.
Yeah.
And know him well. I might be loving some sort of human construction of him.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a lot of what you're saying. I go back to the Christian creeds. So like the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
And, from centuries ago, but it's still something we affirm today, just a catalog of really basic fundamental Christian beliefs. And I think I wrote down a couple of statements in there. That God is the creator of all things visible and invisible. That's a philosophical statement at this point. That's not just, he means demons and angels. It's like, yes, but also what about abstract ideas?
Yeah.
And in other words, you could say there's a little bit of Plato, perhaps, in there that they were thinking of. Then you have words like Jesus, the Son, being begotten, not made. Co-substantial with the Father.
What does that mean?
Of the same essence. So these early Christians who pretty much hammered out our theology for us centuries ago were using philosophical categories to think more clearly and fully about
and
God.
so that's what I was like I can say those words, but that doesn't saying those words and then having the understanding of what that means is totally different.
You're saying leaning into that has given you a deeper understanding, a more accurate.
I mean, I'm still on the beginning of my journey, but I think a lot of these things is like they should change the way that you worship, the way that you pray, and the way you think about God and evangelize. It impacts every part of your life. But at the same time, it's very difficult for a lot of people because, I mean, it'd be nice if you study it and also enjoy it at the same time. But I mean, of course, a lot of these things
those don't always overlap.
They seem and sometimes are very boring, which is, I think, the main reason why most people don't delve into them.
Yeah.
What would you say as to somebody who thinks that it's just boring?
I think it depends what you love. I love hockey. So I love watching hockey. I'd never find a game boring because I love it. Now, chances are if I brought you, to a hockey game, you'd be like, where's the grass? Where's the, why is the ball so small? Why isn't it bigger and white? And you'd be like, where, being from where you're from, you'd be like, there's a better sport, and it's called soccer, okay, or football, whatever. And the difference there is a difference in loves. If you love God, really, I mean, why would it? How could you find this stuff boring? I don't know if you could.
Yeah.
There might be some searching that has to go on there within psychologically for why that's the response. But I think there's a sense in which it's been ingrained in us today, Christians, in the modern era, to think that faith is supposed to be that way. That there's a sense in which when you're trying to find answers to questions and you're trying to defend it and you're reasoning about it and you're doing this philosophizing, that you're actually destroying faith. That faith is, you're talking about arguments. There's no arguments for God. You just have faith that there's a God. And I think the issue sometimes isn't so much that there's a lack of love, it's just that we've misunderstood what faith actually means. We've turned it into, and we use this word already, but an epistemological category, which is just a category of knowing. The way we know that Christianity is true, or certain things are true, like within Christianity, is just by having faith. But that's just not how it's used in the New Testament. No, I mean, I think it's right to say that the apostles were pretty adamant that the resurrection was true, and the way that they affirmed that is through fulfilled prophecy and eyewitness testimony. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, nowhere do you see Paul just kind of going to these different places throughout the world just going, well, you just have to have faith. I mean, why are you asking these questions?
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me in Acts chapter 17, when Paul is, in Thessalonica and heading on his way to Athens, like we were talking about. And it says, as usual, Paul went into the synagogue and reasoned with them, explaining, proving. You know, think about just the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're not quoting messianic prophecies just because it's fun. They're quoting it because they're trying to demonstrate that Jesus truly is the Messiah as predicted in the Old Testament. They're doing apologetics. That's what it is. And I think we've turned faith into a weird way of knowing, as opposed to a way of trusting. What we know to be true.
I would consider faith, the definition I kind of live by in, is that I believe in light of the uncertainty, but I don't think it's warranted to like if somebody just tells you, well, believe because that's I don't think that's reasonable enough given like what we mentioned earlier, all the impacts it's going to have in your life. I mean, the Bible tells you you're going to encounter some like being
suffering,
socially at least.
Suffering will eat away at that.
And so it's for the suffering that you're committing to, and in some places even martyrdom, being killed for what you believe. I mean, I want to be pretty confident before, I mean, and of course there's always going to be uncertainty. I think that's a given, but I still want to have some confidence. And I think there's the arguments are like for Jesus's resurrection is, which as you said, is like what the faith is contingent on. I think it's like, I think they're reasonable. I think they're reasonable to believe in. And so, but,
you can have both is what you're saying.
Yes.
You know, there's kind of three elements to faith is the reformers have always emphasized. Belief. You know, it's hard to trust in God if I don't believe in him, but also assent to that belief. It's not just the belief, it's the assent to it, but then also the trust then. You know, belief and assent is not enough. James even says the demons have that kind of knowledge of God, or that kind of belief. But then it's also a matter of the engagement of the will. You know, and so when you start to look at faith a little more carefully and you break it down into the way the reformers have, you start to see where faith and reason both have a say in it, or both are a component of it.
Yeah, for sure. If people are looking for resources, what would you...
Oh, well, I would say, what are you reading?
Well, I think at least what you've... I mean, I don't think...
What has helped you?
I don't think... for apologetics, I think for sure On Guard by William Lane Craig. Even just if you don't have time to read it, I think even listening to one of his debates are very fruitful, I think.
Joining one of our reasonable faith clubs on campus, which is an extension of his ministry. Yeah, and so he's a good starting place.
Books like On Guard and Reasonable Faith, which goes even more in depth.
Those are not easy books.
No.
I've always found that someone who does a great job with that is Gary Habermas.
You
from my
studied
school,
with him, right?
Liberty University. And so I think he just came out with his big book, his magnum opus on at least part of it on the resurrection. That might be a little too much, but he's got stuff all over YouTube, and he's got stuff you could find on Kindle. And yeah, Gary Habermas has been, at least when it comes to resurrection, really formative for me. He's a good source. Finding what's interesting and just learning to realize that it is okay to be inquisitive in our faith. You know, it was said a long time ago that it is a faith-seeking understanding, because our love of God grows with that understanding. I guess my only caution would be as we go out and we look into some of these sort of philosophical sources, whether it be Plato or Socrates or people more accessible like Craig or Habermas, and as we mentioned, is to really lean into it, to not do it partially. You know, Francis Bacon, who was a Christian and a philosopher, and we sometimes call the founder of the scientific method, said, "A little philosophy inclineth one to atheism, but a depth in philosophy," and I'm paraphrasing him, "inclines one's mind to religion." You know, so don't skim the surface. Really dig deep. And I have found, I think it is you are finding out, is that it doesn't really lead you away from God. If anything, it's helped bring me closer to him. The Spirit has used it to bring me closer to him.